The bulk of all internationally traded crude oil in 2022 comes from three regions. The first is the most important, the most obvious, and the most problematic: the Persian Gulf. Before roughly 1500, the region was in the middle of everything. What global trade existed was dependent upon the lands and waters surrounding the Persian Gulf as a means of connecting the vast territories between Europe and the Far East. But the Americans were hardly the first people to find the region aggravating. In large part, the very existence of the deepwater technologies owes itself to European attempts to avoid the Middle East altogether. From the time the Portuguese were able to shoot their way into India in the early 1500s, the need to pass through or stop in the region more or less evaporated, and the entirety of the Middle East from Egypt to Persia more or less slid into strategic irrelevance. Oil changed things. The monetization of the old Zoroastrian lands made Persia matter enough to trigger British imperial attention, with the status of Persia becoming integral to war efforts in 1939 to 45. The real explosion of activity happened later, with the discovery and exploitation of oil deposits throughout territory that now comprises not just southwestern Iran, but also Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. While evolutions and manipulations, both market and military, have varied these players' individual output widely over the years, their collective output has been a fairly reliable 20 million barrels a day for the past 7 decades. As of 2021, that 20 million barrels is roughly 1/5 of global supplies and 1/2 of internationally traded crude. These 8 countries have 2 things in common. First, they are technologically incompetent, or, at the very best, criminally lazy. Their educational systems are sad jokes, and local citizens lucky enough to gain technical degrees out of region tend not to return. The locals' incompetence is hardly limited to the energy sector. These countries, as a matter of course, import millions of foreign workers to handle everything from their power systems to building construction to civic infrastructure. All 8 countries rely on outside workers, primarily from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Turkey, Algeria, and Egypt, to keep the crude flowing. The region doesn't need all of these foreign players, but each in-region country needs at least one of them. Second, as technically incompetent as these states are, they are even less competent when it comes to naval action. Few have ever domestically constructed anything more interesting than a speedboat, and in nearly all cases, not even that. Iran's navy in particular is mostly comprised of inflatable Zodiacs, imported of course. None have the capacity to patrol their own coastlines, much less their trade approaches, much less the trade lanes upon which their income, their existence, depends. Every single one of them is utterly dependent upon outside powers to get every drop of their crude production to end consumers. For more than half of those exports, that means reaching the Northeast Asian states of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. For half of the remainder, it means reaching Europe or North America. The order may not have been possible without these countries' oil, but neither would these countries have been possible without the strategic overwatch of the order. The second major zone of oil production is the former Soviet space. While this region's politics and geopolitics are, if anything, louder and messier and heftier than the Persian Gulf's, the calculus of the region's oil is far simpler. The Soviet Union was a massive producer of the black stuff, but the vast majority of that output was consumed within the Soviet Empire. Things only started to get internationally interesting when the Soviet Union collapsed. Soviet industry collapsed along with it, while all the old Soviet satellites in Central Europe broke away. With Russian internal demand failing, and other former Soviet imperial demand now on the other side of international borders, the Russians had scads of spare oil output that needed to find new homes. In the first wave of post-Soviet exports, the Russians focused not simply on what they knew, but on what their infrastructure would allow. Piped exports to their former satellites, one of which was now a constituent part of a reunited Germany. The second wave expanded upon what the Russians knew. thickening and extending those pipe links through Central Europe into Western Germany, Austria, the Western Balkans, and Turkey. In implementing Wave 2, the Russians discovered that ports like Gdansk in Poland, Ventspils in Latvia, and Constanta in Romania could serve as offloading facilities for Russian crude, enabling it to sell on to customers far and wide. Phase 3 was about linking up and building out Russia's own ports to serve the same purpose. Primorsk near St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea, and Novorossiysk and Tuapse on the Black Sea. During these first 3 phases, the other former Soviet states were hardly standing still. Now divorced from their former imperial master, all needed to establish their own income streams, preferably ones that were not beholden to Moscow. Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan both courted any and all foreign investors, with BP and Exxon proving the most interested. The foreigners executed some of the most complex seismic, drilling, processing, and infrastructure programs the energy world has ever seen, and began shipping crude out via whatever route proved possible. Some routes tapped into legacy Soviet infrastructure, heading north and west to places like Ventspils or Novorossiysk. But as time ticked by, the flows were increasingly concentrated into a single pipe corridor that began at Baku, Azerbaijan, and ended at a supertanker port in the Mediterranean city of Ceyhan, Turkey. What all these options have in common is that they all flow in the general direction of Eurasia's European extremities. And since Europe was peaking demographically, there was little reason to expect European oil demand to increase ever again. Sure, the Russians were filling a larger and larger slice of that demand, but market saturation was decreasing their pricing power. The Russians hated that. So in the 4th phase, the Russians started the long, expensive process of routing fresh pipe infrastructure east to the Pacific. Problems relating to permafrost and mountains and distance abound, but if there's one thing that can be said for the Russians, they are never intimidated by size. As of 2021, there were 2 main lines in operation: a very long, very expensive, very economically questionable pipe that stretches from western Siberia to the Russian port of Nakodka on the Sea of Japan, and a far shorter spur line that delivers crude direct to the old Chinese refining hub of Daqing. Add it all up, and you're talking about 15 million barrels per day of former Soviet oil, fully 11 million barrels per day of which originates within Russia's border, of which slightly over half is exported. Easily the second largest source of internationally traded crude flows on the planet. There are problems. Most of Russia's oil fields are both old and extraordinarily remote from Russia's customers. Fields in the North Caucasus are all but tapped out. Those of Tatarstan and Bashkortostan are well past their peak. And even those in western Siberia have been showing signs of diminishing returns for more than a decade. With few exceptions, Russia's newer discoveries are deeper, smaller, more technically challenging, and even farther from population centers. Russian output isn't in danger of collapsing, but maintaining output will require more infrastructure, far higher upfront costs, and ongoing technical love and care to prevent steady output declines from becoming something far worse. The